When real men can't sleep, real men do the news. And so here I am once again doing the news. As always, Insomniac. For the people who are new to the channel, I've been doing this for a while. And when I used to originally do the channel, I've been an Insomniac for decades. And so 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, doing the news. And so this is kind of where we are. The channel has once again restarted for whatever reason. I have not been able to sleep all that well for the last several weeks. And now that the office is up, might as well get work done, right? There's a really interesting story. I'm not going to keep this long. And I mean that this time. I used to get joked on saying that because it would be like, I'm not going to keep this long. And then 3 hours later, the video is still going. It's not going to be the case. Not going to keep this long, but a very interesting story that is coming out of the Wall Street Journal that could have expansive repercussions, even though I don't necessarily know if it's been talked about all that much. It has to do with this notion of, let's say, the hegemony of the dollar or the economic hegemony of the United States. And in some respects, the way that we've used the dollar as a weapon has served to be the undoing of the dollar. It's almost like there's certain things that you don't want to press on because if you press on it, it may collapse. It's kind of like that, where you can have this kind of economic system. You can have dominance in a particular area. You can even use that dominance in minor degrees in order to affect your will, and there may be certain advantages that just kind of intrinsically is linked to that particular edifice. By the same token, you may also be aware that if you need to overly use it, or if that edifice gets challenged, that edifice could collapse. And my thing is that we've overplayed our hand on this notion of sanctions, or overplayed our hand in using, let's say, the SWIFT system, or stealing money from governments and various banks, meaning the money that they basically stole from Russia, or the resources they stole from Russia, forcing a default. That's astonishing. That's Russian money. Afghanistan, stealing billions of dollars from Afghanistan from those banks. If you're putting your money in a bank and you're one of those countries and you see, wow, the West will steal your resources on a whim, why would you want to deal with the West like that? And if you're a sovereign nation, wouldn't you try to, prevent or protect your sovereignty, especially around this notion of economics? You may not necessarily be able to do it immediately. You may be a smaller country that may be at the whims. However, when another option arrives, those other countries that are greatly concerned about the U.S. using its economic might in order to affect political agendas will make that switch, and they will change over purely out of a protective capacity. I guess my point is, this is kind of like sometimes legal devices where, let's say, the president or let's say a political party has a bill or a law that they basically agree with. However, they don't necessarily want to overpress the advantage because they know if that thing goes to court, that thing is going to get struck down, or at the very least they don't necessarily know. So they don't necessarily overly use it. I guess my point is, finance system, or the system of finance that we basically use in this world that has been organized going around after the Second World War, with the US basically being the main hegemon on that, and usually and the reserve currency, that is under threat, and that is under assault. And it's under assault from a few things, all of which are pretty much internal, with the exception of one being external. And that one thing being external was described as basically the brick in the wall, that if you remove it, the wall falls down. That wall being the US's economic hegemony and the supremacy of the dollar that is being challenged by Saudi Arabia and the yuan, Chinese currency. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig what I do here, you can always support through PayPal or Patreon. You can also definitely subscribe and become a member of this channel. I am trying to regrow this channel. I had stopped for a while because I got ill in August, and basically I needed a break. So I had been burning the candle at both ends for years. And at the point where I got ill, especially in 2021 and 2020, 2021 and 2020, at the end of 2020, very difficult years. So getting back to some level of normality, burning the candle at both ends again, let's do the news. Right here, this is the article that I'm talking about. Saudi Arabia considers accepting the yuan instead of dollars for Chinese oil sales. There are a few things that should be discussed. This notion of the reserve currency. The reserve currency allows the United States to have, let's say, a certain advantage, a certain special quality because of the necessity of dollars. And the only place that you can get dollars is basically from the United States. So if oil from Saudi Arabia, this notion of security for oil and that agreement that was made, if you have oil, this kind of commodity that is necessary around the world for energy production and everything else, basically a vital resource, and that vital resource is priced in dollars, then it makes dollars that much more expensive, that much more useful, and that much more vital to kind of world economics. Again, it is the reserve currency. Also, that is buttressed on a few things. One, full faith and credit of the United States, meaning the U.S. basically pays its bills. A stable political system with rational economic policy. Again, the economic policy has to pay attention to the fact that the dollar is a reserve currency and not do anything to basically jeopardize, let's say, the economics of that particular country, and certainly not to do anything to the currency itself. A sophisticated military that can basically protect the country. Military is the beating heart of a nation. And as long as that country can preserve itself, and military is one of those ways it preserves itself. The wealth and political relationships around the world. The fact that the U.S. is either the first or second largest economy and has been that way for a while gives it all sorts of clout and leverage in this economic space. Think back to the JCPOA for a moment. When the JCPOA was passed, and this is the Iran deal, nuclear deal. If you remember, Europe, and I believe Russia and China, were the guarantors of that. So the U.S., Iran, signed an agreement. The agreement basically puts limits on Iran's capacity to kind of go into nuclear power and that type of thing. All of this was under the guise of preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons, despite the fact Israel has nuclear weapons. People don't like to talk about it, but it's true. And part and parcel to the reason they don't want Iran to get nuclear weapons, which would be defensive in nature. Iran hasn't invaded anybody. But the part and parcel to the reason is for its defensive capacity. If Israel has nuclear weapons, it can strike Iran willy-nilly. Iran would always be at a disadvantage at that point because Israel has, at the end of the day, a nuclear weapon. Now, whether they would use it or not, who knows? But at the very least, from the standpoint of nuclear weapons, the whole point is, at the very least, at the end of it all, I can end the world, or at the very least, make it overtly horrific. Don't screw with me. That's kind of where that goes. That's the whole point of North Korea having it. And North Korea is not firing off a nuclear missile willy-nilly. They know they'll be obliterated within a few seconds or a few minutes. No, it's typically for defensive capacity. If you have the U.S., South Korea, pretending as if they're going to continuously invade you, and you know how the U.S. has acted around the world in these coups and these killings and these knocking off other governments, if you know that, or for that matter, even invasions, your nuclear weapon is the deterrent and is the thing that makes North Korea a non-military option country. And so from the standpoint of Iran, they would be thinking of it in similar terms. I don't have this belief that Iran is just going to fire off a nuclear weapon. I believe they're rational actors. But beyond that point, from the standpoint of the political relationships around the world, well, if you think of when the U.S. pulled out of the JCPOA, France, Britain, Germany, etc., basically the signatories, were supposed to be able to protect Iran. The whole point is that if the U.S. pulls out, all of these other countries continue their dealings with Iran, meaning the businesses, the oil businesses, etc., that basically went into Iran after the sanctions was over with. But what ended up happening? Europe did not have the economic might to protect Iran. And many of the companies that were in Europe that were doing business with Iran stopped because they didn't necessarily want to be sanctioned by the United States because of the economic market that the United States possessed. The economic dominance in and of itself was so great that Europe, despite how big it is, could not compete and protect Iran's economy. That's what I'm getting at. The wealth and the strength in that sense of the economic might of the U.S. also buttresses this whole reserve currency stuff. Also, oil. And that's the point. Oil. The petrodollar. Again, if you have to price oil, or let's say Saudi oil, in dollars, then the only place you're going to get those dollars from is from us. And if you're going to get those dollars from us, it adds that much more necessity for the dollar and gives it that much more impact in the context of the world markets. What happens if Saudi Arabia starts to price it in yuan? Now, the reason that this is taking place, and I call it a shot across the bow, is because the U.S. and Saudi Arabia has had a relationship going back for decades. Trump takes it to a new level when he gets in office. And he is close as can be to Mohammed bin Salman, who's crown prince, but basically the de facto leader of the country. Now, Biden gets in office. Biden doesn't like it. And not just doesn't like it, because Donald Trump is basically toxic. And because Jamal Khashoggi was basically carved up with a bone saw in a Turkish embassy. In Turkey. Well, you have this situation where Biden gets in office, doesn't phone call, condemns the war in Yemen, even though he continues to help out in that war in Yemen, basically killing, murdering, and starving civilians en masse. And on top of that, distances himself, which I'm not against, but distances himself from MBS and from Saudi Arabia because of how close the relationship was with Donald Trump and, of course, the deboning of Khashoggi. Great. It's a backwards country. However, that has consequences. And one of those consequences was basically Saudi Arabia souring on its relationship with the United States. And so, in getting that across and showing how much that relationship is basically soured, when this event came up, meaning the Ukraine invasion by Russia, Joe Biden understood that they had a problem if they were going to pass sanctions. And this is where it basically hits us. The United States was bringing in, I think it was 400 or 700,000 barrels a day of oil. You had a situation where Europe was using 4 million barrels a day of oil, and not one person could explain how that was going to be made up. So you had a pipeline in Germany that the United States didn't particularly like and was basically trying to stop. Again, two sovereign nations, the United States uses its economic might in order to hit an ally, and for that matter, an opposing country. But again, the agreement was between two sovereign nations. Germany, vassal state. But still, you get my point. But it gets across how important it was for them to get that oil. If you remember, over the course of this year alone, Europe was complaining, oh, we're not getting enough resources. Oh, energy prices are too high. Oh, Russia is not giving us the oil or the gas, the liquefied natural gas, LNG. It's not giving us what we need for our energy needs. Now, this wasn't true. By the same token, they still needed the energy, and they needed basically that product from Russia. So now you have this situation where this was all before the invasion. This was before those sanctions. This was before they decided to go after Russia in this kind of economic war. So the U.S. goes hat in hand to Venezuela, a country that they basically tried to have murdered. They go hat in hand to Iran, even ignoring the attack on Iraq by Iran that hit that Israeli facility, all because they need oil. So when you have this situation where now the U.S. picks up the phone and they call Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia doesn't answer. Saudi Arabia doesn't answer. I'm trying to get across how frayed the relationship has become. The United States has increased the amount of oil that it itself produced. So this situation where this over-reliance that was there prior became somewhat less, meaning the U.S. has less of a need than Europe for the oil production because the U.S. produces a lot of oil. Yes, that oil goes out of the country, and that oil is not owned by the U.S. government, that is owned by private companies and everything else. But in a worst-case scenario, that oil probably can be refocused internally. I guess the point that I'm making here, though, is Saudi Arabia is pissed off. And because they're pissed off at what they consider to be held at arm's length, because of what they consider to be criticism by the Biden administration, the JCPOA being renewed, which is something they don't necessarily want. If you go back in time, I think it was a New York Times article, was talking about how and why Obama greenlit the war in Yemen. And the reason that Obama basically greenlit the war in Yemen was because he didn't want Saudi Arabia to intrude upon him trying to get the JCPOA done, because they didn't agree with the JCPOA. So as Biden is trying to push through the JCPOA to get his hands on oil, Saudi Arabia doesn't like it. Saudi Arabia is against it. This is just one additional item that is basically pissed off Saudi Arabia. Now, this is not an absolute. It's not the easiest thing in the world to transfer over from dollars to yuans. And there are all sorts of issues associated with it, dealing with the Chinese economy and how they deal with their finances and so forth. But that's secondary to the point that if Saudi Arabia decides to pull the trigger on it, they can pull the trigger on it. It's just a technical issue they need to overcome. And China has control over their economy. They can make all sorts of agreements and deals if they need to. There's also this other aspect where China has been investing magnificently in Saudi Arabia, putting in billions of dollars or billions of yuans into the country. And so the belief is, well, if we are denominating this oil in yuans, then we can have a closer relationship with China also, making the Petroyuan on some level, I don't want to call it profitable, but definitely on some level in Saudi's interests, especially if it's not this kind of immediate changeover, but we're going to start pricing some of our oil in yuans. We're going to start adding to this where you can kind of grow it into something else to rival this notion of the petrodollar. It's very interesting. I mean, the thing becomes, though, what happens if Saudi Arabia does that? And if you look at these things that buttress the dollar, we no longer have a stable political system. We no longer have rational economic policy. We do have a sophisticated military, so fair enough, but it's not necessarily being used to the best interest of the United States. It's used as a weapon. We do have wealth and political relationships, but the catch with that is we ostracize ourselves because we even sanction our allies when those allies do something we don't particularly like. Meaning, the dollar, that at some level is supposed to be apolitical, has now become a weapon. So many of those countries that want to use and deal with economics, but also want to be sovereign, if given an option, may decide to do something else, not wanting to be held at the whims of the United States when they do something as a sovereign nation that the United States does not like. We're isolating ourselves, ostracizing ourselves in some way from the larger community. The United States only make up 5% of the world's population. Europe and the US, a fraction of the entire globe. China is 1.3 billion people. India, 1.5 billion. These are massive, massive countries. So this is not even a situation where we are basically the majority in regards to the population, even though much of the wealth is basically handled in a small amount of hands. My point is the fact that we're using that now as a tool of Western interests, as opposed to allowing those countries to use it in somewhat of an apolitical fashion for an economic system to kind of act on its own in this kind of capitalistic fashion or the invisible hand. We put countries at odds. We make them adversarial. And those adversarial nations will not help us when we need it, for one, unless there's a pound of flesh to go along with it. But two, puts them in a position where they are looking for something else and will go to that something else. It's kind of like political parties. It's like you have two political parties that basically get lazy and get corrupt and start almost rigging the business in this kind of monopolistic fashion to the point where it sours all sorts of people on it. And even though those people can't necessarily start a third political party immediately and they can't find somewhere else to go, they may pull themselves out of the political system, almost a third choice, almost a vote of no confidence in a way. Or the moment that somebody else can start something else that seems to be viable, those people will leave. And they would leave as a direct result of being taken advantage of when they didn't have a choice. Same thing. Same thing, at least in the way I frame it. I want to read parts of this. The Saudis are angry over the U.S. lack of support. Went there. China buys more than 25% of the oil that Saudi Arabia exports. If priced in yuan, those sales would boost the standing of the Chinese currency. The Saudis are also considering including yuan-denominated future contracts known as Petroyuan and pricing model of Saudi Arabian oil company known as Aramco. The majority of global sales, around 80%, are done in dollars, and Saudis have traded oil exclusively in dollars since the 1974 deal with the Nixon administration, security, basically, for the kingdom. For China, using dollars has become a hazard, highlighted by U.S. sanctions on Iran over its nuclear program and Russia in response to the Ukraine invasion. China has stepped up this courtship of the Saudi kingdom in recent years. China has helped Saudi build its own ballistic missiles, consulted on nuclear program, and began invested in MBS bin Salman's pet projects, such as NEOM, futuristic new city. Saudi Arabia has invited China's President Xi Jinping to visit later this year. And they go into the relationship deteriorating with the United States. Here's another thing. Whereas the imports of oil from the United States has diminished, again, because the United States has become, I don't know if we're still an exporter. I know we were an exporter of oil. Well, by definition, that means you need less. Whereas the need for China has basically grown. You have China, or the Chinese system, where they are pulling a huge number of people out of poverty, which is going to give those people more buying power, which would mean those people are going to also start using more energy as they go from pillar to post, as they drive from this place to that place, or they're taking flights from here to there. Meaning, the necessary and the use of oil for China goes up, in which case the relationship with Saudi Arabia gets closer, where ours deteriorates that much further because we basically need them less. So I guess my thing is, and of course, people poo-poo this idea, right? I mean, especially people in the U.S. Oh, they're not going to do that. Oh, they'll never do that. They're not going to do that. They've talked about it before, but they never went through it. Yeah, they talked about it before. They never went through it. By the same token, the relationship between the U.S. and Saudis have basically gone in one direction. And even during the Trump administration, Democrats were, at the very least the left, have been very skeptical and vocal on their dislike of the Saudi regime. And on top of that, after the bone sawing of Khashoggi, that horse at that point was out of the barn. Here's another part right here. The Saudi move could chip away at the supremacy of the US dollar and the international financial system, which Washington has relied on for decades to print treasury bills it uses to finance its budget deficit. This gets into the reserve currency stuff. This is the bonus, the blessing, the benefit of having a reserve currency. We can run those major budget deficits. The world has accepted. You can only get dollars from one place. Quote, the oil market and by extension the entire global commodities market is the insurance policy on the status of the dollar as a reserve currency. Right here. If that block is taken out of the wall will begin to collapse. Hence my point about the shot across the bow in regards to this notion of global hegemony of the dollar. Saudi Arabia, maybe not entirely by themselves, can unravel that particular instance. But, like I said, the other items that buttress that particular faculty are also under degrade. And so we will see what this looks like. And we will even see if Saudi Arabia goes through with it. But if they indeed goes through with it, Chinese currency is going to get a boost. The U.S., let's say, the backing of the dollar, the thing that makes the dollar, the currency itself, on some level gets undermined. And what that means, anybody's guess. But, like the economist said, I do suspect that removing, or at the very least having something to challenge the petrodollar, where it's no longer denominated entirely in dollars, like Saudi oil, it would have ramifications. And those ramifications will be directly related to market. If we lose the reserve currency status, from my understanding, the economy on some level will need to shrink. But we'll see. I mean, this is up in the air. This is just one of those things that they're thinking about. But the fact that they're thinking about it, and the fact that the relationship is soured to such a degree, this is almost them saying, hey, if you want to repair our relationship, we may get rid of this. If you don't want to repair our relationship, and you continue to be obstinate and hold us at arm's length, we can make your life somewhat miserable, and we can alter your status in the world from a standpoint of currency. We'll see what happens. I would say if MBS goes this route, you better be very careful about whether or not the U.S. starts making plans and decisions to get rid of him. I suspect he's there as far as his usefulness goes. But we'll see. I mean, the U.S. would consider that somewhat existential and challenged, but to basically economic hegemony. And they would basically regard that probably every bit as much as they regard China as an existential threat. And they would probably respond in kind in order to find somebody who will not do something like this. But we'll see. I don't necessarily know the leverage and the capabilities of the U.S. in regards to Saudi Arabia. But it does seem like Saudi Arabia is putting up either a travel balloon or a threat. We'll see where it goes. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, and I'm going to say subscribe. Thanks, everyone. You guys are up very late. I can't believe you guys are up this late.